Okay, I think we're going to get going, if that's all right. Hopefully you've got enough drinks to keep you busy for the next half an hour, 45 minutes. Firstly, I just want to say thanks for coming. I'm very happy to be doing events again. It's been literally 2 years and a month since our last one that we sneaked in just before everything shut down. So this is very happy to see so many faces in real life, which is fantastic. Today, I've forgotten what I need to be doing. Housekeeping, not expecting a fire alarm out the front door if one does go off. Toilets are through there if you need them. Okay, so just kick us off for 2022. We've got John Grindrod, who you may know from Concretopia, How to Love Brutalism, and Outskirts. He's back with Iconicon, which kind of, I guess, gets us up to date after Concretopia, looking at the last sort of 30 years or so of Britain. And I'll leave you to John. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you all for coming. I think we're all still slightly in that sort of shell-shocked phase of leaving the house and being in a room with other people, which still feels a bit weird. So it's amazing that you've come along this evening. I really appreciate it. Thank you. As Alex said, I've written a couple of other books before. I did a book called Concretopia, which had a lot about Sheffield in it, and actually one of the reasons that I ended up coming to Sheffield and doing quite a lot of research here was I'm from Croydon in South London, and as soon as I knew that I was interested in sort of, the urban rebuilding of Croydon in the sort of post-war period, I realised quite quickly that if you researched that in the local libraries, there was absolutely no information whatsoever. Because, it was just as if Croydon was a medieval town and there was no more information about it since then. And the great thing about coming to Sheffield was here was a town that, here was a city that was absolutely kind of, at the forefront of modern post-war design, and had kept all these amazing records, and there was just so much to find out. And I found it, such a kind of inspiring place to visit and to explore and to, to read about and find out about. So, so Sheffield for me has always been a place that I've found, really inspiring in all the things that I've done. And then I did a book called Outskirts, which was about the green belts. And again, Sheffield was a pioneer with green belts. It was one of the first places that had any green belt in the country. And so again, you were there. There we are, Sheffield, kind of leading the way. And that was also kind of fascinating to research. And again, sort of in this period. So this period that I've written this book about, which is since 1980, it's been quite a different story. Quite a different story for all of the places that I thought I knew from having researched Concretopia, sort of going back to them and looking at them with a different lens. You suddenly were aware that actually a lot of things have happened in a period when, I've been alive. I was born in 1970. You sort of take a lot of this stuff for granted. All these things get built, things change, you just kind of go, whatever. And then it also sort of slightly washes over you. People get cross, people get excited. You never quite. It all sort of washes over you a bit, really. And it was only when I started to kind of sort of seriously look at the stuff that had happened, I suddenly became really aware that there was this huge story of stuff that's gone on in my lifetime that I just totally ignored. And it was just, hidden in plain sight, this story. So that's kind of what this book is, really. It's the story of, it's the story of the things that have happened during my lifetime that I hadn't really noticed. And I think a lot of us, would say the same, that these things have happened, and we were kind of present for them happening, but they've slightly passed us by. Since March 2020, we've been living through one of the strangest periods in modern British history, stranger than the oil shocks and the 3-day week of the 1970s, or stranger than the riots of 1981 or 2011, and stranger than the Brexit referendum. Stranger and more powerful even than the Y2K Millennium bug. Seems hard to believe. An unintended consequence of that pause that we've had in normal activity caused by the pandemic and lockdowns and social distancing it's offered us a moment to step off the treadmill of our everyday routines, and on exercise walks and mindfulness moments we've seen the truth of the places around us. But what is it we've actually seen? Over-ambitious new extensions, grey paved drives and grey window frames and grey render, weird conversions, crazy postmodern infill houses, 30 semis with Kentucky Fried Georgian front doors and Victorian conservatories, unexpectedly handsome new blocks of flats, 80s cul-de-sacs, new schools that look like flats, and old schools turned into flats, former council blocks surrounded by brick-clad interlopers, so-called parks for business or retail, the knackered landscapes of casual habitation, unplanned in their chaotic muddle, and competing horrors with the occasional bright spot. So this evening we're going to go on a time-travelling journey over the last 40 years. We can't see everything from my book, but if you do get the chance to read it, you will be able to gasp at Prince Charles's new build workhouses and fake Georgian squares in Poundbury, where the dreams of the place seem best summed up by the shop there that I saw that sells second-hand wedding dresses. Or you can be awestruck by Wonderworld, which was essentially going to be a bit like the Millennium Dome, but built outside Corby in 1982. And it was going to have water slides and monorails, besides zones on health and safety and banking. Or you can marvel at the luxury transparent swimming pool built in mid-air in 9 Elms in London, where passers below can enjoy a wonderful view of the millionaire's Veruca bath. So my talk's going to last about 30, 40 minutes, and then after that we can have a little chat and you can ask questions. One of the lovely things about this evening is we've got several of the people that contributed to the book here, which is really brilliant. So, and I feel incredibly moved and touched that people do share amazing stories of their lives with me for these books, because they aren't a sort of dry sort of architectural record of these things. They are a sort of social history of our experience of living with these buildings, and so I'm hugely appreciative of anybody that ever helps me out with anything, and also but particularly people that share kind of amazing stories. So this is going to be a vaguely chronological tour of British architectural icons since the 80s, and we're starting with Liverpool Garden Festival. I'm glad that is actually the picture that I see here, and not some random image, which I slight fear. Liverpool got its development corporation in '79, Michael Heseltine told me. It got its garden festival in '79. Oh, and I listed the Albert Dock, totemic. He had a knack for saying things like totemic during the interview. His newly minted Merseyside Development Corporation's first task was to tackle the derelict docks, a 250-acre section at Dingle, the old Mersey foundry, and a former municipal tip, Dingle Tank Farm, was chosen as the site for the Liverpool International Garden Festival. Before anything could be done, vast amounts of methane had to be pumped from the industrial waste, as the site wasn't just unappealing, it was hugely dangerous. A competition was held in 1982 to design a centrepiece, the Festival Hall, which was won by engineering giants Arup. And a few years later, it might have been termed an icon, because that was its purpose, to represent the new spirit of the city, to become its logo. Arup had only 12 months to build it, hence the relative simplicity of the structure. The Festival Hall was a high-tech greenhouse whose lightweight tubular frame was clad in aluminium and ribbed polycarbonate sheeting. 13 different countries were represented in exhibits on the site, and 250,000 trees were planted. There was a nature trail, a sculpture zoo, and of course, a Beatles maze. The festival was opened by the Queen and Prince Philip on the 2nd of May 1984, 2 years after the riots, and it was not maintained and soon became derelict, only for the remains to be recently re-landscaped. And now I've just heard that new houses are being built on the periphery and gradually creeping in, even though quite a lot of that methane, quite a lot of that pollution is still bubbling under the site. So buildings can be icons of different things, and sometimes accidentally so. Most interestingly to me, they can be symbols of our politics and culture, encapsulating the dreams of a particular moment in time, or the flaws. In the mid-1950s, a young Newcastle accountant realised it would halve the cost of buying a house if he built it himself. And so he dug the foundations and fixed the concrete like one of those ill-advised maniacs on grand designs. And this man was Laurie Barrett. And by 1979, his company had become the UK's #1 private house builder, knocking out 10,000 homes a year. The homes they would build in the next decade would define the era, every bit as much as Dynasty, Shake and Vac, and Body Shop soap. Barrett actually had a helipad installed in the grounds of his home. It wasn't just the adverts with Patrick, what was he called? Patrick, I've forgotten the name of that actor. Patrick. Sorry? No. The guy that used to do the adverts was he also did the Protect and Survive voiceover. So it was a very cheery choice of person to do the adverts for Barrett. I've gone completely blank. But anyway, so he actually did have a helipad built in his home, and he would go and visit 2 building sites a day. His speciality became a type of house designed to tempt the first-time buyer onto the property ladder, the starter home. The developers took inspiration from an influential book produced in the heartland of Thatcher's Britain, Essex. And the Essex Design Guide had been produced by the county's planners in 1973. And it aimed to steer private developers to ditch any of those lingering modernist pretensions, all those things I love, instead embracing the unique building character of the county and to re-establish local identity. Developers took the basic gist of the Essex Design Guide, the cul-de-sacs, the heritage-inspired pitched-roofed houses, but stripped out all of that local detail and offered a simplified corporate version instead. The conservatism of the result was put down to the need to rush blandly uncontroversial design through planning. The arrival of computer-aided design helped too. At Wimpey, house designs could be saved to disk, imagine, and then sent around to their 11 regional offices where a bit of fiddling could be done to, say, choose appropriate materials, or not. One of the people I interviewed about her 1980s McAlpine home showed me the brochure with its classic 80s names, the Trafalgar, the Queensborough, the York, and its Princess Di lookalikes standing on gravel drives, and pointed out that they appeared to be trying to build Surrey in Rochdale. In 1985, Barratt launched their premier collection, larger detached houses with up to 6 bedrooms, often in gated communities. That year, Margaret and Dennis Thatcher, who you can just see down in the corner, they bought one beside Dulwich Park in South London. But the dream did not last. The Thatchers put it up for sale in June 1991, a year after Margaret had been ousted as Prime Minister. They'd only spent 6 nights there in 6 years. The lucky new buyers could be reassured that all of Margaret's hand-picked Italian floor tiles, German kitchen equipment, and ubiquitous heavy chintz would remain. It's 1985, and Mick Jagger and David Bowie were recording a video for their Live Aid single, Dancing in the Street, in an empty warehouse in Canary Wharf, an abandoned dockside area in East London. There wasn't much dancing in the street there in those days, what with there being few people around, and even fewer streets. But that same year, a trio of new Docklands buildings were approved for Canary Wharf, and one was to be the tallest in Europe. Developer Ware Travelstead organised a symbolic launch on site. He invited 200 bankers from across the world, along with the chairman of the Bank of England, who was going to turn the first sod of earth on the site. Protests from local Docklands residents had begun in earnest. This isn't, I still can't quite believe the story is true, but it is. A lorry filled with a herd of sheep and 3 beehives had been driven onto a shed on the site the night before. During the event, as the bankers sat by the marquee, a group of protesters on cranes above the site unveiled banners emblazoned with the slogan, "Kill the canary, save the island." The sheep and bees were quickly driven from the marquee. The sheep were shooed towards the seated bankers, and chaos ensued. I mean, imagine if I herded some sheep through this field now. It would, not ideal. And then the beekeeper placed a hive on the spot on the ground where it was going to be dug, and then promptly kicked it over, and loads of the people were stung. I mean, it sounds more like a police academy film than it does actual British social history, but there we are. Travelstead would later go bust. And Michael Heseltine told me when I interviewed him that it was only the intervention of Margaret Thatcher that saved the project, because she rang Canadian developers Olympia and York and asked them to take over. One Canada Square's steely Art Deco-inspired tower was designed by Caesar Pelli. It's the undoubted architectural icon of its age in London. The roads beneath Canary Wharf were another story entirely. Sarah Fox, project executive on the build, pointed me to the indirect road lighting that had been created by placing lights between carefully angled louvres on the walls, leading to the car park underneath. Designed out of the Chicago office of US architects SOM, like so much of Canary Wharf, one tiny and symbolic problem had occurred. They put them so they're facing the wrong way, she explained. Most of them had never been to the UK and didn't have a clue that you drove on the left. And so helpfully, the supposedly concealed lighting instead dazzled the subterranean driver. Postmodernist extraordinaire Terry Farrell had been encouraged to enter a design competition at another Riverside site in London, at Vauxhall, by the president of the RIBA. He'd been informed that no one else had entered. I said, "That sounds like my kind of competition," he said when I interviewed him. A government holding company had bought the site, but the architects were completely unaware it was on behalf of the British Secret Service. Just 2 of Farrell's team were vetted and allowed to attend client meetings, where the job was explained to them as if in code. The functions of the spaces remained top secret. there was much focus on a single central room in the building, a circus that all the others needed access to. And the designers kept giving this important room fantastic views. And their clients kept telling them not to, until finally they admitted what it was for: shredding. Farrell's love was for everyday taste, and so he was inspired by Golden Age cinemas, old radios, and the kind of fancy additions people make to their homes. The resulting flamboyant ostentation of MI6 recalls the video for Queen's Radio Gaga, itself a colourised postmodern take on Fritz Lang's Metropolis. From Vauxhall Bridge, you can imagine crowds of Queen fans clapping in sync before it, Mercury prowling on the pinnacle, Brian May's hair rampant on the ramparts. If MI6 wanted to remain invisible, Terry Farrell was not the architect to have chosen. And as with all of Farrell's postmodern London buildings, such as Embankment Place above Charing Cross and Egg Cup House, the studios for TV-AM, MI6 displays a grand optimism, fusing heritage with forward thinking and unafraid to make a colourful statement. And also, it's been blown up 3 times in James Bond films, which is pretty cool by any standards. Now, one of the most famous Terry Farrell buildings in Britain isn't even by him. Quarry House in Leeds looks for all the world like the offspring of Embankment Place and MI6, but in fact it was designed by the Building Design Partnership, an endlessly adaptable, faceless architecture company who a generation before had created another sensational one-off, the brutalist landmark of Preston Bus Station. As at Preston, they had succeeded in nailing the predominant style of the day to maximum effect, and it replaced Quarry Hill, the huge enclosed council estate built in the interwar period, the first of its kind in Britain, decades before Park Hill or the Barbican. What eventually went up in its place was Quarry House, headquarters for the NHS and the Department of Social Security. And it immediately became known as the Kremlin. People's assumption that the Kremlin was designed by Terry Farrell isn't just down to the stylistic similarity of his work. Farrell's company had master planned the area for the council in the late 80s before any reconstruction work had begun. I can't say that was hugely successful, was all he had to say on the matter when I asked. Its lasting achievement seems to have been the creation of a straight route from city centre to Quarry Hill, a grand pedestrian boulevard with, it was hoped, equally grand buildings constructed alongside, most of which are still being built today. But as an industrial revolution city whose heyday was in the 19th century, Leeds had been only superficially invested in the post-war modernist project. They've always felt like kind of the opposite end of a spectrum from Sheffield. And so was born a curious offshoot of postmodernism, the Leeds look. Brian Walker, chairman of the city's development council, denied such a thing existed, but a walk around the city centre disproves that. One of the first Leeds look buildings was Westgate Point, designed in 1987 by David Lyons. The Leeds look and the associated pitch roof brick buildings that began to spring up around the country in the late 80s and early 90s symbolised a different side of the Tory boom. If the bright, sometimes shocking postmodernism of Farrell or Quarry House was akin to Thatcher herself, the disruptive force in an electric blue suit, the Leeds look was more like a Mount Rushmore of John Majors. Are they icons? Well, of course they are. Of economics, if nothing else. The first out-of-town supermarket in Britain opened in 1964, soon becoming the very first Asda. And it wasn't until the 80s that other supermarket chains began to follow suit. To appeal to the architectural geeks among us, each developed a unique look. Hokey pitched roof Tesco Beetham. Supermodern Sainsbury's, pretending they derived from Norman Foster's Sainsbury's Centre Art Gallery. Over-varnished craft centres turned out to be Morrison's. Asda stuck with anonymous fiberglass airships and blank red brick facades, a style best described as Asdustrial. My hotel for tonight, the budget Ibis, overlooks Sheffield's Waitrose, which looks like a Pomo crystal palace, which says everything about Waitrose's self-image.
It used to be a Safeway.
Did it? Well, yeah, well, that's really interesting because Safeway had a thing where they had a desire to to look like sort of Palladian villas. You know, there was a real kind of like classical kind of influence to a lot of Safeways. So that is really, yeah, I'm not surprised. So the most startling symbol of Millennium Manchester's ambition and swagger was Beetham Tower. The city's tallest building looms, hoodie up to the elements, skin as thin as a cyclist's waterproof. From the ground, you might not notice the tower here at all. Well, on a calm day, at least. Despite various baffles and tricks, when completed, the wind and its howl grew as famous as the tower itself. Coronation Street, filmed half a mile away, had to add extra background noise to muffle it. The developer was Stephen Beetham, then aged just 28. He'd become director of the family property business at the age of 20. In his early 20s, he converted an old Polytechnic library in Liverpool into luxury flats and turned Wilberforce House, which was a 1960s building ironically belonging to Liverpool's city planning department, into what the architects describe as aspirational city centre apartments. Manchester's Beetham Tower was designed by Ian Simpson and stands 47 stories high. He was at pains to explain that the sort of inner-city high-rise he'd designed was a world away from the council towers of the 60s. For one, this was not in any sense social housing. The likely residents were expected to be either first-time buyers and young professionals or ageing empty nesters, retiring to a glamorous city centre life. Simpson had always intended to live in a penthouse, and indeed he does, with its olive grove and his collection of Scandinavian and Italian mid-century furniture and glass, and 200 different seating arrangements. So visit Britain around the Millennium and you'd find 27 major projects. Art galleries, concert halls, museums, science centres, bridges were being constructed to celebrate that transient moment. In effect, a different competing lottery and EU-funded Guggenheim Bilbao was being launched almost every month for 3 years. The Eden Project, the Deep in Hull, the Millennium Centre in Cardiff, the Sage in Gateshead, the Imperial War Museum in Salford. It was an inspiring moment and one we look back on now with a sense of awe that was entirely lacking at the time. And here's an instantly recognisable, and before February I would have said enduring, icon of contemporary London, the Millennium Dome, now the O2 Arena, sadly shredded in Storm Eunice. So synonymous with the city is it that it's even the star of the opening titles of EastEnders, though whether they will update the graphic with its latest "someone left a cake out in the rain" incarnation is anyone's guess. We can't move the Millennium, is architect Mike Davis of Rogers Stirk Harbour recalled telling the Millennium Commissioners in a crunch meeting. In December 1996, his winning design for the central structure was shown off just 3 years before this as yet unstarted building had to be finished, fitted out and ready for opening. Davies is a high-tech Dumbledore, long pointed grey beard, half-moon specs perched on the tip of his nose, dressed from head to toe in bright red, as he has for decades. "We knew Greenwich inside out," said Davis, "because I'd stood on the site in March that year and I remember thinking, I don't think I've ever been so cold in my life. I checked and there was no land over 200 feet between the Millennium Dome and Siberia. This huge circular 365-metre tent would nestle perfectly into the bend in the Greenwich Peninsula, the poison site of an old gasworks. 12 masts would hold up the tent, and the edges would be pulled into 24 scallops. There were mutterings in the architectural press that the design was merely a version of Fry Otto Stadium for the 1972 Munich Olympics. And Ted Happold, who was the dome's lead structural engineer, had worked with Otto on some of his extraordinary vast suspended tents. But Davy's inspiration went back even further than that Olympics. He wanted to recreate the sense of wonder he'd felt when visiting the Festival of Britain, aged 9. The dome continued to evolve during its swift construction, including the material that was used to cover it. It was originally going to be covered in PVC, but they changed it to something more durable, a material called PTFE, which was made from glass and Teflon. And it was used on some stadiums in the US, but hadn't been used in this country. To test it, Davies threw a little bit of it on his stove and lit it, and all that happened was that the edges just went a little tiny bit brown. But these days, that's the least of its worries. Nigel Coates of Branson Coates Design for the National Centre for Popular Music was a real showstopper, a set of 4 stainless steel drums whose roofs rotated with the wind. Each drum held a different exhibition space, including a 3D acoustic landscape design by Martin Ware and an interactive music-making gallery. The museum was a long-held plan by the council, but the lottery was the thing that made it possible. As one of the smaller projects around the Millennium, it suffered from Britain's Millennium saturation. Too many icons, too few visitors. It opened on the 1st of March 1999 and closed in June 2000, after only attracting a quarter of its planned 400,000 visitors per year. And it's now, of course, Sheffield Hallam's Hub Students' Union building. My feeling is that the problem wasn't with the design or with the museum itself, it was with the logjam of attractions launching at the same time. I think maybe 5 years later, and it could have thrived. But at that particular moment in time, there was just too much competition. So one of the things that Sheffield did with their Millennium project was to link together an ambitious remodelling of routes through the city. A private development of shops and flats and workspaces surrounds more civic developments, the Peace Garden, Millennium Square, the Millennium Gallery. The Winter Garden, whose form is echoed in the equally intriguing Moore Market, is a cheery Millennium structure, generous, memorable and handy cut-through. This is an example of a new branch of town planning known as placemaking, espoused by Richard Rogers to New Labour in his Urban Task Force, whose most famous example around the Millennium came in the post-bomb redevelopment of central Manchester. The heart of the city is one of the few Millennium projects still being expanded today, with remaking the heart of the city to the Revenge, leading to any number of flat-fronted fake brick towers of the sort being built everywhere, from the Olympic Park to New York. Meanwhile, Sheffield has also been a leader in the reuse of existing buildings, from old industrial premises into cinemas or galleries, to the slowest refurbishment known to humankind at Park Hill, begun by Urban Splash back in 2009 and still far from finished. And increasingly, it is looking like a building that has been saved to death. It seems incredible to think now, but the Angel of the North could have once been built rather further south. Back in 1988, Leeds City Council ran a competition for a major public art piece to be constructed in the Holbeck Triangle, an area stranded between railway lines just outside the main station. A maquette had been built and exhibited at an art gallery, and it didn't go any further. Gormley tried for a similar commission in Hull, but once again was thwarted. Finally, Gateshead said yes. By the mid-1990s, Andrew Dixon, Deputy for Northern Arts, was pitching for £250 million to build new arts and cultural facilities across the North East, with a focus on the decaying quayside at Gateshead. The saviour of the plan was, once more, the National Lottery. Gateshead had a history of commissioning large-scale art pieces, including another of those garden festivals back in 1990. Within 5 years of the rise of the Angel of the North in 1997, came the march of other projects enabled by that lottery and EU investment. Gateshead's 1950s rank Hovis flour mill was repurposed by Ellis Williams Architects as the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art and opened at midnight, the 13th of July 2002. 5,000 people queued outside that night, and it attracted a phenomenal 300,000 visitors in just 3 months. Along the waterfront, past a large car park, a starkly contrasting high-tech building by Norman Foster rose up, the Sage Centre for Music, beneath whose vast wobbly canopy could be found 3 of the best music venues in the country. And leading up to it would stand a glorious new pedestrian bridge for the city designed by Wilkinson Eyre. It is a spectacular design, a curved footbridge and suspension arch, which takes 4.5 minutes to tilt 40 degrees to allow tall ships to pass beneath. When London unexpectedly won their Olympic bid in 2005, proposals included 4 new permanent sporting venues in Stratford, and they would end up as the Athletic Stadium, now home to West Ham FC, the Copper Box multi-sport indoor arena designed by Make, Zaha Hadid's Aquatic Centre, and the Velodrome, which is now the Lee Valley Velo Park, designed by Hopkins. There would be an athletes' village too, converted into flats after the show, a new infrastructure from rail lines to cycle tracks. The Olympic Park itself would become a green space in a part of the city where there was very little. And there would also be a commercial opportunity leapt on at once by developers building a vast new shopping centre, so big it called itself Westfield Stratford City. Soon the most visited mall in Europe. In the park, 5 new neighbourhoods would be built with the same postcode, E20, as fictional Walford in EastEnders. The Pringle-shaped velodrome, designed by Hopkins, was the first of the venues completed and on budget, and its red cedarwood cladding makes it feel more furniture than architecture, and also hides the classic Michael Hopkins tent beneath. The roof is suspended on a vast net of cables. But at the other end of a budget and deadline spectrum, the Aquatic Centre, one of only a handful of major structures in Britain designed and finished by Zaha Hadid. It was a scramble to get it ready in time, and in classic Zaha style, she blew the budget 3 times over. But no one was about to argue with Zaha. One of those vibrant urban quarters we all love is springing up in the Olympic Park now. All terraces of mid-rise blocks with classical proportions, artisan coffee shops and the like in the ground floor units, very 2010s, very fixie bikes, very beards, very dungarees. The iconic buildings of the last decade have been those terraces of flat-fronted brick or stone-clad flats, houses or offices with Georgian proportioned windows, often with metal balconies. They are the children of Tate Modern, and they speak of an era of austerity and conservatism, of homes as investments rather than places to be lived in. In time, they will become a shorthand for our age, just as 1930 semis are for the interwar era. The most famous piece of contemporary social housing was designed by David McHale, Annalie Riches and Cathy Hawley for Norwich City Council's Regeneration Company. The 105 homes of Goldsmith Street sit on the edge of the city centre, near and inspired by its famed golden triangle of terraced Victorian cottages. There's a mixture of flats and houses of varying sizes in these pale brick terraces, whose cosy proximity brings to mind the golden triangle too. The architect successfully negotiated with the planners to reduce the street width to 14 metres rather than the mandated 21, helping to give the area an intimate, domestic feel rather than a car-dominated suburban one. Perhaps its most celebrated aspect is that the whole social rent scheme is built to passive house standards, drastically reducing energy costs and emissions. One of the big issues will be helping residents maintain the integrity of the passive house technology, which means no wall-mounted TVs or floating shelves, because the screws would perforate the membrane, keeping the homes airtight. It won the Rebert Sterling Prize in 2019, a popular win seen as a game changer for this kind of development. Both environmentally and socially conscious architecture, as much about community building as it was about pioneering a new philosophy. In its way, it and the wave of new architecture that has come with it feels as radical, hopeful and significant as the Garden City movement a century before. So, I've covered these and many more places in Iconicon, which I've interviewed architects and residents, politicians and planners to get the inside story on what has been built in Britain since 1980 and how we've lived with those buildings since and what we've done with them. I think the aspirations of our modern era can best be summed up by the hoarding put up by the developers at a place called Everything 9 Elms in London. Food, drink, fitness, art and chance encounters on a par with the best of everywhere. What kind of dreams are those? Thank you very much.
Thanks. I mean, I don't know if there's any questions. Have you got a bit of time?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Questions, comments?
Hello.
Yeah,
Let's start in front.
thanks, John. Brilliant. Really great. I've not read the book yet, so that's brilliant trailer.
I've spoiled it now.
I was just going to ask you that. You know, you put the stuff about Sheffield, and reflecting on what Sheffield did in the kind of 60s and that kind of modernist. You know, it had an identity, a modernist identity, and it's lost that now. And you know, the stuff you put there around heart of the city, and it just feels like. I'd just be interested in your opinion on, because Ian Nairn wrote a book of essays back in the, even that book he wrote, he did an essay on about 12 places, and he came to Sheffield in sort of the late 60s, I think, and he said this is a place that is the future of what cities should be, and then just reflecting on what's happened since then. Just be interested in your view on that.
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable walking around Sheffield. All those incredible kind of post-war relics that are still there, you know, the ones that haven't been either sort of swept away or sort of altered beyond recognition, but the ones that are kind of, you know, there are so many still. There are so, you know, they still kind of like dominate the sort of city centre, and you know the interventions that have been going on with the kind of heart of the city thing are much more sort of discreet, and they are much more sort of targeted as, you know, as a kind of, you know, new routes, and you know that sort of idea of a way of navigating through the city. So they're not even as much about the buildings as they are about the actual kind of the landscape and the shared bits of the streetscape. So necessarily that it has more of an impact in the way that you move around as a pedestrian, but it has less of an impact kind of visually. You know, it doesn't, you know, they're not the same kind of like big sort of planned gestures in the way that, you know, Sheffield had those big sort of planned moments in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So yeah, I mean, I think it's unfair to compare the two eras because Sheffield, like everywhere else, has had to cope with an entirely new way that buildings are financed and and how planning is done. All those the way that we end up with new buildings since that kind of early 80s Thatcherite kind of revolution of sort of public-private, everything has to have a sort of, in any sort of public scheme, has to have a huge private investment. And then also you then get, the PFI stuff a bit later. It has meant that, and also the watering down of kind of planning, the influence of planners over this period as well is another thing. So you sort of got two things that sort of hamstrung sort of everywhere, really, and Sheffield is, Sheffield obviously had sort of a terrible, recession and, terrible kind of, high unemployment and all of that stuff happening in the 80s and 90s, and it's sort of taken, it's that sort of, there was no energy left in the city for the kind of stuff that was going on in Docklands, for example, or something like that. That all of that momentum was sort of taken away and sort of thrown away by having these terrible kind of social crises that have been politically kind of engineered and sort of visited upon the city. So I do, I know exactly what you mean. I do think some of the kind of interventions and stuff that have been done have been really good. I do think some of that kind of connecting stuff up on the ground in the city centre has been really good. And I do think there's been a lot of very good kind of reuse of buildings in Sheffield that other places have sort of struggled with or have ignored and just haven't kind of owned it as much. I think Sheffield has been very good at recognising the kind of the soul of a place is as much with its kind of newer buildings as with its older buildings, and I think actually in a lot of cities they haven't appreciated the 20th century legacy and they've just got rid of them, and they've just lost that stuff. And I still feel like Sheffield has got a recognisably kind of Sheffieldian sort of soul on the street as you walk around it, in a way that, someone like Birmingham has sort of like thrown away all of that stuff, in a way that Birmingham is sort of constant revolution. I come from Croydon, which does it's like a mini Birmingham, where it's basically like every 40 years they kind of go, oh my God, what did we do? And just get rid of all of that and put an entirely new thing. And then 40 years later they go, oh my God, that's so 40 years ago, what were we thinking? And then that thing just kind of keeps happening, that sort of churn. So, I don't think that's a very good way to kind of be running a city. Yeah. Sorry, so there were more hats, weren't there? There was something in the second row. Yeah.
It's almost a bit of speculation, really. I was wondering how much Brexit's going to have an impact on things, especially with a lot of the examples we give are urban centres like Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, London. But then you've got this idea that there are somewheres and nowheres. Yeah. And it's that sort of divide that's going to have an impact on designing planning in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And also just the loss of EU funding for stuff. A lot of the funding that the EU did was sort of match funding other so they did a lot of match funding of like lottery projects. They did a lot of match funding for sort of private investment and stuff like that. So there were lots of schemes that just wouldn't exist that we just totally sort of take for granted as things that have happened. And sort of particularly a lot of those Millennium projects, a lot of those things wouldn't exist without the EU. And I think actually there was just a very sort of selling that to people, selling the transformative value of the things that were done and connecting it to the EU. I don't think that was done very successfully. I don't think people realised necessarily that there was a connection between some of these things, and that that was actually what the EU was helping with. So, yeah, I do think it will have a long effect, and we can't at the moment. We're just the interesting thing is that we are at a point where a lot of quite massively serious world events have happened. You know, the pandemic, you know, the war in Ukraine, as well as Brexit. And at the moment it's quite hard to untangle what effect each one of those things is having. But they're all clearly having effects, and they're having different effects, or they're amplifying each other's effects. And we don't really know what those effects are going to be like. We don't really know what. I think it's hard for us to sort of know where that's going to end, really. So yeah, I mean, I'm terrible at speculating. So yeah, I'm not going to go into that game. Sorry. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you another second question.
Oh, great! Hooray!
We've had a big shocks being lost around high streets.
Yeah.
Which I know have been lost. Do you think that making town centres into more residential areas is a good way forward for British towns, or do you think there still needs to be that kind of leisure centre that the town works around?
I do think that there does still need to be that. I think the idea of kind of reducing stuff is probably sensible. You can't kind of maintain, I don't think cities can kind of maintain such a vast sort of sprawling network of, 15 different malls that all kind of, sort of vaguely sort of cancel each other out, and then various high streets that kind of are all in competition. And so a bit more sort of strategic thinking around trying to protect the most important kind of environments and creating a kind of an area that everyone wants to go to, and it does feel like a kind of leisure thing, rather than everything just sort of being kind of piecemeal kind of housing and shops and stuff, so that everywhere becomes really low energy. I think that would be a disaster. I think keeping the energy level up in the, that's one of the brilliant things about Sheffield, is you kind of walk around and there's a real energy to the centre, and it doesn't, it feels really urban and exciting, and it doesn't feel kind of like low energy suburban. And I think what we don't want to happen is for places that have got that energy to kind of disperse and lose it all. And and I think actually probably after all the kind of lockdowns and everything, and people not being able to go into city centres or not wanting to, there's a real thrill actually in being able to go back to places where people are and things are happening and it feels exciting. And it is hard to do that, I think, if you sort of disperse that energy. So yeah, I think that I do think there is going to have to be a shift to more residential in town and city centres, but I do think that we need to kind of make sure that there remains a kind of core of like enough dense excitement and leisure opportunities and all that stuff that it doesn't get watered down. Otherwise, it just becomes a bit of a nowhere. Sorry, you've had your hand up a lot.
Yeah, it was quite heartwarming seeing Norwich in the last slide. I went from social housing as a child in South Yorkshire to social housing in Norwich.
Oh, okay.
And it was only as an adult I realised it felt like utopia, the social housing in Norwich. When I look back on it now, it felt like I was in some kind of Dutch city or something along those lines. And reading that, it seems like the city had lots of pride in its municipal housing.
Yeah.
And obviously it's trying to bring that back again with what they're doing at the moment with the narrow streets, which is what I fondly remember about that area.
Yeah.
Do you see it? It's quite kind of like a wish. Do you see it in other areas taking on this kind of thinking at all? Or
yeah, there is a bit of that, and I think actually a lot of that is being driven by a group of quite headstrong architects who are not following the planning guidance to have, all of the car parking or the huge width streets and all that stuff, and actually going, well, no, we're going to have a car share scheme, or we're going to do something, a bit more radical with that, or we're just not going to offer any car parking. You're not going to be able to have a car if you live here. That's just how it is. And quite often, local authorities who are hiring these people to create kind of little housing schemes and stuff are not realising until quite late down the line that this is what actually is fundamental to some of these schemes, and they're trying to kind of introduce that by the back door, but there is no back door. There is no way that they can get that back into these schemes. So I think there have been a few architects, and notably Peter Barber in London does this, but there were a few practices who are doing this, who are sort of bouncing these projects into an area that is sort of making them impossible for that kind of safety first planning guidance of kind of, everyone's got to be very suburban, and we've got to have kind of, everything's got to be very dispersed, and we need lots of car parking, and we need, it's all got to be car based as a kind of philosophy, and they're actually deliberately breaking those rules. And that fills me with hope, actually. The fact that some of these schemes and quite a lot of these schemes are being built, which would have been unthinkable a little while ago, that's quite a good sign. And one of the things that I think about this book is that if you've read Concretopia, or you know the kind of story of that era, of the stuff that was built, this era and this book sort of almost feels like they feel like kind of mirror images of one another, and that we start in 1945 with all the legacy of the kind of 1930s, sort of terrible sort of slum housing, and particularly if you were working class, loads of overcrowding and insanitary stuff, and sort of people sort of introducing a lot more social housing, council housing, also the introduction of the welfare state, the NHS, all that kind of movement, sort of egalitarian thing, and then the arrival of kind of new planning laws, the new towns, all of those quite radical things all happening, and then gradually the money running out, and it kind of, and it's sort of being, it's sort of fizzling out in the late 70s, and then this book sort of feels like we kind of like we do the same journey in reverse, and we kind of go from having all of that stuff to kind of gradually seeing all that stuff sort of sold off and become private again, and no longer be in public ownership, and no longer be something for everyone, but to be something that a few people can make money out of. And it, and if you get anything good, it's all down to some billionaire having a philanthropic gesture rather than that. So this story of of those kind of new sort of social housing schemes by practices like Peter Barber and like Mikhail Riches, I think are really incredibly hopeful. And I was sort of trying not to end the book on a real downer. I wanted to kind of see, that, and there actually are some really positive stories. There's the amazing story of Granby, 4 Streets in Liverpool, which didn't win the Sterling Prize, it won the Turner Prize, which is insane. And that was entirely a regeneration project of this little, sort of 4 streets of houses that was driven by the residents, and the residents were sick and tired of having all these derelict houses. They set up their own street market, they made a song and dance, they tarted the area up a bit as much as they could, and sort of made it feel a bit more kind of livable and cleared it up. They fought back against people who wanted to demolish the stuff. They began to get advice. They then ended up becoming a community land trust, so that they owned the area in perpetuity. And they got in Assemble, that kind of young architecture practice. It was amazing and kind of transformative, and helped them do the thing that they wanted to do. So the entire spirit of that was the residents who drove the project, and the residents who got what they wanted out of it at the end, and that was it's an incredible story. And there were quite a lot of community land trusts have now been set up, none of them with quite the same kind of like magical impact of that one. I don't know whether I find it hard to believe any like community land trust story is ever going to be quite that amazing. I mean, the guy that I interviewed in the book about it said such a lovely thing. He was like, and I thought it was an inspirational story, and I was in it. Which I thought was lovely, and so there are kind of like some positive things in an era where I do feel like we've got quite a lot of negative things to kind of talk about. So I have tried to kind of balance that, because it can otherwise feel like it's quite a depressing story. Yeah. Hello.
Hi, thanks. My question actually sort of segues into what you just said there about
right.
I'm actually from the negative side, because you mentioned about sort of regression and where we were living in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
Thinking. And you touched on there something really interesting about housing developments and quite utopian architectural philosophy being injected in that, which is brilliant. I can imagine that working in such a world where you've got a sort of local authority controlled transport scheme and things are generally going to cars.
Yeah.
And I wonder what your view was when you spoke to people about this disconnect and policy landscape that we have. So we're having these fantastic utopian housing schemes, but then you've got privately owned, disaggregated transport schemes, and what it means to get around, need cars.
Yeah.
Then actually these housing schemes aren't benefiting people and making the day-to-day lives difficult.
Yeah.
It feels like what we need is that region planning again across
Yeah.
the house and not building for the infrastructure as well.
Yeah, definitely. And the worst kind of examples of that are those developer estates that kind of creep up, you know, around nothing. You know, they creep up around, you know, they've got no infrastructure at all, you know. Forget having, you know, a local GP or anything. You haven't even got a shop, you know, you've got nothing. And there are so many examples of that. I sort of feel like every town I go to has got one of those that have, you know, oh yeah, I live out there, you know, and people, you know, people sort of talk to me about, you know, living on those kind of estates where you have basically no infrastructure and you just feel abandoned. And some, weirdly, you know, this again goes back to the kind of mirror image thing. The estate that I grew up on, which started to be built by a private developer in the 1930s and then was bought by the council, was right on the edge of Croydon. This is why I ended up writing about the Green Belt, because it was right on the edge of Croydon, right by the edge of the Green Belt. And we had like absolutely no facilities at all, and we had like one road, you know, there were like 25,000 of us and like one road that kind of came in and out, and, you know, one bus, and it was, you know, you just felt like you were so like abandoned living there. And, you know, I feel like, you know, a lot of these estates that have been built now are very like that estate was before the council sort of took it over, you know, and actually tried to do some stuff. And it's easy for kind of private developers to kind of buy the land and do the, you know, and do the kind of basic, you know, house plans and, you know, meeting targets for this, that and the other, because, you know, all local authorities have got targets for, you know, how much stuff they've got to get built and all of that. It's all very attractive to sell the land to these private developers who promise all of this stuff, but without the other stuff around it, it's a miserable existence if you can't drive, you know, if you've got no, I mean, I don't drive, you know, I couldn't live somewhere like that, because it would, you know, it's quite frightening, the idea that you would be sort of abandoned somewhere like that on the edge where there isn't any way to get round. So, and that was certainly, you know, that it sort of came up quite a few times in interviews with people that I did, that, you know, they were kind of like, they did feel like they just existed, they could only have that life because they had a car, and there wasn't any attempt to join up, you know, their life with the life of the town, really. You know, it sort of divorced from that. Yeah, I mean that, you know, until the fact that planning has become such a kind of, you know, neutered occupation is the big problem there, because that should be something that, you know, planning together with politics should ensure that can't happen. But until planning becomes, you know, gets back some, you know, some kind of its mojo, that's not really going to happen. Sorry, somebody I think put their hand up. But I might have misseen.
Well, I think I've got so let's wrap it up.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John, for coming across up to the north on your northern leg of Iconicon. And thank you for coming. It's been really nice having people in real life again after 5 p.m. It's a novelty for me. So yeah, thank you, and thanks to John. Books are available, drinks are available.
Support your amazing bookshop.
Thanks, John. That was, really good.